Welcome to the Venezuelanalysis podcast. I'm your host, José Luis Granados Ceja. The Venezuelanalysis podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You hear news and in-depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. And on today's program, it won't surprise you to learn that we are talking about U.S. aggressions against Venezuela that have been ramping up in a very worrisome way over the last few weeks. And to talk about this, I am joined by fellow staff writer at Venezuelanalysis, Cira Pascual-Marquina. Cira, as always, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, José Luis. It is important to be talking about Venezuela now. Everybody knows that there's imperialist escalation against the country, and it's important to understand what has been going on really over the past month or so, which is the period of the escalation, but of course in general to keep an eye on the U.S. military and otherwise aggressions against the people of Venezuela. So thank you very much.
No, absolutely. And we're really grateful to everybody who tuned into our last episode. It was our best episode yet. And obviously, because this is such an important issue and we see that a lot of people are paying attention to this, and who better to bring you this information than we here at Venezuelanalysis. And of course, we want to start with this story that I'm sharing here on the screen. U.S. strikes alleged Venezuelan drug vessel killing 11. Maduro obviously condemning this immoral threat, as he puts it. So on the last episode, we were talking about, this military escalation, this intimidation tactics, the positioning of these boats very close to Venezuelan waters, to the Venezuelan coast. Obviously, since then, we also saw the deployment of F-35s to Puerto Rico, which is, of course, in the Caribbean, very close to Venezuela, could provide for a very quick mobilization. But on the last episode, we were speculating, is an invasion on the cards? And of course, we said no. I mean, I have to emphasize this every time, and I say it with a smile, because anybody who thinks that 4,000 troops are going to invade Venezuela successfully are fooling themselves. This is a very well-organized population, and of course, worth emphasizing as well, the mobilization of the Venezuelan population, in addition to the armed forces, through the Bolivarian militia, that we've seen this incredible response by the Venezuelan population, but of course also the armed forces, which has always played such a critical role in the Bolivarian Revolution, the Unión Cívico-Militar, the civic military union, which of course, to just give a brief example here, rescuing the president in 2002, saving Venezuela from living under a right-wing U.S.-backed dictatorship, thanks to the bravery of the troops and, of course, the population, which responded. And that's really where we saw this emergence of this. And that has been consistent, right? All of these coup plots, all these efforts to try to pull away the armed forces from the constitutionally mandated government there have all failed. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that there is this long-standing relationship. There is a loyalty to Venezuela's constitution itself, a product of a important popular protest. We're going all the going all the way back to '99, and obviously there's a long list of examples, more recent, of seeing that example of the population, the armed forces refusing to cave into U.S. pressure. All that to say that, we were speculating about, is there going to be invasion? Ultimately, we did conclude that it was unlikely given the present circumstances, but we've definitely seen a major escalation from the United States with this story here, the strike on this alleged drug boat, because really we don't know that if there was drugs, if it was human trafficking, if it was fishermen. The truth is that when you blow up a ship, as they did, you don't leave any evidence behind. Of course, also worth mentioning, this is a grave violation of international law. The United States obviously has no regard for international law, and so we're seeing these kinds of actions on behalf of the Trump White House in this moment, and so this strike, I think in a lot of ways, certainly in my case, came somewhat as a surprise. We've heard a lot of bluster, a lot of bravado from people like Trump and people like Marco Rubio. Of course, his longstanding interest in toppling left-wing governments here in Latin America. Now that he's Secretary of State, he has a lot of tools to do it. He appears to be the major actor behind this. He appears to be the one who's driving this policy. He's the most vocal defender in any case of these violations of international law, of the United States giving itself the authority to conduct extrajudicial murder in international water. And that is the language that we should be using, of course. But that isn't the only escalation that we've seen. Of course, we've also saw Trump hinting at possible strikes inside Venezuela amid these rising tensions, and Maduro in this case calling for de-escalation, always emphasizing that Venezuela is not a place where drugs really are transited. And this is, of course, obvious to anybody who's familiar with the issue. Most drugs move through the Pacific, and in fact, they move through the ports of Ecuador, a U.S. ally in the region. So, this is, again, worrisome if we were suspecting that perhaps the United States would not take this to this level. We've already seen them strike this boat. We've seen them talk about a potential strike. And, more recently, we also saw this. Venezuela is calling these regime change provocations when U.S. forces boarded a fishing boat, the Carmen Rosa, inside Venezuelan waters. So yet again, another escalation. And to wrap up this introduction here, Cira, of course, we saw this final news here. Another murderous strike on another boat, apparently in international waters. It's hard to know really where this is taking place because basically the only evidence we have is the one that the United States gives us, these aerial images of these strikes. It's very likely, Senator Ron Paul mentioned that it was a drone strike, so it's quite likely that are drones that are attacking these vessels. Again, killing, murdering 3 people this week just off the coast of Venezuela. So this is the reality now. This is the situation that Venezuela and Venezuelans are facing with a very bellicose United States, which seems to be desperate to send a message and really follow through on these threats. As we say here in this post on our account, which we actually lost for a minute there, and thankfully we recovered. It's very suspicious that we'd be the target of these kinds of attacks during this period. Of course, where we see the United States striking Venezuelan vessels just off the coast. This seems to be U.S. policy now. And so that's where I want to hand it over to you, Cira. What do you make of these developments? What do you think about the fact that this is no longer just threats, but we see that with one, you could maybe write it off, but 2, this is now establishing a pattern. U.S. policy appears to be to conduct extrajudicial murders in international waters as an intimidation tactic against Venezuela.
Indeed, as you say, José Luis, this is a policy of extrajudicial murders, and it has been wrapped up in a discourse of anti-drug trafficking battle or war, but indeed this is just the continuation of what the US has been doing freely for the last 25 years against a sovereign and later a socialist project, the Bolivarian Revolution. So I think it's important to highlight that first, as you did very well, and we are kind of like right now focusing on this last period, this last month or so. I think that it's important that we recap some of the events. This begins around the time, specifically around August 7th, when the Trump administration increases the reward on Maduro. And from there has been a permanent escalation to $50 million, by the way, a policy that should surprise nobody, but that has historical resonances that are rather concerning. Now, I think that when we think about the situation and it has been building up, I think we have to clarify a couple of things. First, that the mainstream media calls this a conflict between Venezuela and the United States. The first thing we have to say is that there is actually no conflict between the United States and Venezuela. There is an aggression from the United States, from the Trump administration, and from prior administrations through against the Bolivarian process. This is the first thing we have to highlight because, of course, the mainstream media has a lot of muscle, a lot of presence, and we always have to make sure that we clarify in terms of discourse what is going on, because this is a war that has several elements, that has several legs, and as all wars, the media leg is a very important element here. You were saying that we are not expecting to see Marines coming into the coast of Venezuela, and indeed for now that is true, that is the case, but this is something that is rapidly becoming a military aggression, and that's escalating. As you were saying, it began with a strike against a boat with 11 people, and then there was this boarding of a ship shipper of a fisher folk boat and a retention of these folks. And then just on Monday, there was this later aggression. What is going on, really? I mean, I think that if we are trying to understand why and how the US is escalating this, we could make we could go into speculations. They are testing the waters, they are testing the response. I think it's important that we talk about the Venezuelan response, the Bolivarian revolution's response here. Because since this whole situation began and towards the end of August, actually, President Maduro has made a call for people to enroll in the militia. This is not a draft. This is a call for people to voluntarily join the militia, so to voluntarily join the project of defending Venezuela, of defending the Bolivarian Revolution, but really Venezuela, because you can join these whether you are a Chavista or not a Chavista, and there are a few instances of non-Chavistas who have joined the militia, but of course the majority, the great majority are Chavistas. So how are the people of Venezuela preparing for this is the big question. One, there's this call. Two, there's a very active presence of President Maduro on media, explaining with as much detail as possible what is going on. And this is actually a practice that's very much part of the Bolivarian process, right? Explaining what is going on, going through the situation as well as we can. Of course, information is not always available, and the US does its best to keep us blind on what the real intentions are. They have been clear that there is going to be an aggression against Venezuela, and there has been an aggression against Venezuela. But what the pathways that they are exploring are, we don't know. But President Maduro and other spokespeople of the Bolivarian government have been doing a very good work of explaining what is going on. What is the sense of the situation in the street as we speak, which is another question that folks ask, that comrades ask often. Well, of course there's tension, but if you look outside of my window right now, or if you go to, I don't know, working class neighborhood, any neighborhood, or in the middle class neighborhood, wherever you go, things more or less go on as normal. Of course, you hear people in the streets talking about the situation in more politicized spaces. There's a lot of spaces of meeting, gathering, and preparing for the defense. But in the street, people maybe are talking a little bit about it, but people go on with their everyday lives. This is what happens before war. You know, like you do not know if there's going to be a major escalation, because while we don't think that there's going to be thousands of Marines coming into the port of La Guaira in the next few days or weeks, because there's not enough military buildup from the United States in that regard, although there are plenty of destroyers near us, right? But what we do think that is possible are surgical strikes against infrastructures or against spokespeople of the Bolivarian process. And this is, of course, highly concerning. And of course, what the enemy wants there is to generate a situation of chaos and internal conflict. That would be their objective if they did a chirurgical strike against infrastructure or against the spokesperson of the Bolivarian government.
I want to pick up on that because I think that there is a genuine, legitimate concern that one of these strikes could be what they call a decapitation strike, an effort to take out the leadership. You've mentioned spokespersons, but I would imagine that if they are interested in these quote unquote decapitation strikes, they would probably strike President Maduro himself or the defense minister Vladimir Padrino. What do you make of this possibility of an actual hit on an important figure up to and including President Maduro by the United States?
Yes, indeed, what you say is correct. Well, I think they would go for the top figures, and those would be maybe with Diosdado Cabello, the ones that they would go for, aim for. And it is a real concern. I mean, we have seen the modus operandi of the US in near Asia. We have seen that it's not outside of their way of acting to do strikes against leaders. So we are prepared for that. We, of course, that means that these people are keeping themselves safe, that there are increased situations, increased security, a build-up in security around these spokespeople against this leadership. But one thing that is important here, and is that to understand that these people cannot go cannot totally hide. There actually has to be a presence of these folks, because the truth is that ultimately this project is going to be defended by the people, and the people need to understand what is going on. But going back to this, if they opted for this military option, if imperialism opted for this military option, first of all, we think that they would not succeed. But if there was one such event occurring, I'm pretty sure that the US has it wrong. In other words, going back to when you talk to people in the street, even opposition people are, I mean, everybody who I've met, no, of course, there are fascists around who I haven't met, but everybody is against this situation, is against a military aggression. Everybody is against violence. Actually, President Maduro very precisely has been centering a discourse around peace, and a discourse around peace in the region, because this is not only a problem for Venezuela, it's a regional problem. So if something like that were to happen, first, I think that the expectations that US imperialism would have, if they did it, of generating a profound internal conflict would not unravel. There are millions of people that actually voluntarily inscribed in the militia and are preparing for it. There's also an armed forces that is prepared to defend. And the armed forces are profoundly Bolivarian and profoundly patriotic in the sense of the patriotism of the global south, of the people who are building their own project, of the love for the people itself. So I think that if such a situation were to happen, I very much suspect that even if there were some conflicts, there might be, if there was such an attack, I think that the people of Venezuela, the army, and the people who have enlisted would be ready to stop that. If you move around Caracas or around Venezuela right now, you will see actually, while people are going more or less on their daily lives, talking a little bit about what's happening, but they go on with their daily lives, you will actually see a lot of military posts set up around the city and around the country. And this is important. I think this should be, we do not celebrate it because we do not want to be in this situation, but we think it is absolutely, the people of Venezuela, those who are committed to the Bolivarian process, and anybody who wants peace really is happy to see this military display, this military outpost throughout the city. So that's a little bit of the situation that we are facing now, as per this possible strike that we cannot rule out against a public figure in the Bolivarian process.
I think it's also worth mentioning. I feel like this administration, the Trump administration, does represent a qualitative difference when it comes to the aggressions against popular movements, left-wing governments, particularly those in the region. We talked about Marco Rubio. But I do think that there has got to be people in these rooms where these decisions are being taken that are warning and calling for restraint. Because we have to understand that this would be devastating for the relationship with all of Latin America. And that's even taking into consideration that Maduro and the Bolivarian process, Venezuela as a whole, has been demonized for years now, decades even. And even given that, I do think that you would not see people lining up to support this kind of action. I think there is an understanding here in Latin America that action like that against Venezuela would open the door to action like that anywhere in the region. And as you well said, in places like Iraq, we saw the assassination of Soleimani. And that was devastating, I think, for US relationships in the region. Obviously, there's a lot more, you know, puppet regimes in that part of the world that are happy to do the US's bidding. But certainly here in Latin America, I think even sort of the more right-wing elements, right-wing governments would not tolerate this kind of. And we saw a really important statement come from CELAC. Of course, it wasn't unanimous, and that is worth mentioning. There are actors here in the region. It's really worrisome, for example, some of the positions taken by some of the leadership in the Caribbean, given the fact that Venezuela, when it was able to, when it wasn't being strangled by U.S. sanctions, was very generous with the Caribbean, understanding that it was a member of this community and wanted to, uplift these countries and the peoples in these countries. To see some of the betrayal of that solidarity now is really quite sad. But really, overall, we've seen a very strong consensus, a very strong majority in the region rejecting these kinds of actions. And so there has to be also, I think, an effort to appreciate that, in this region, this would really have reverberations that I think are actually quite difficult to predict of how complicated it could be, because it would just be the absolute worst signal possible. But we're dealing with a bit of a rogue government. I mean, one that is obviously violating international laws, engaging in extrajudicial executions, that now appears poised to crack down on all domestic opposition, taking advantage of the situation in that country as a result of the killing of Charlie Kirk, for example. We saw this week that there is a very active campaign from very senior membership of the Trump White House. I'm talking about Vice President J.D. Vance, Stephen Miller, who very much want to take this moment to crack down on domestic opposition, which would also have reverberations, because if there is a crackdown and people are scared to protest, there might be that given a radical action by the United States wouldn't see the kinds of protests. That's not to say that we haven't seen it. I wanted to bring up this story here from a couple of weeks ago about the global protests that were condemning these actions, and the world is paying attention. So I think it's important to mention that this is happening. But I also wanted to mention this here, which I think I made this comment on social media. It was just the most perfect example of how US propaganda works. We see Ryan Berg, who works for the CSIS Americas. He is one of these, liberal regime change proponents. There's a dime a dozen of these types. Jeff Ramsey also comes to mind. He played an important role in ramping up the aggressions against Venezuela, who takes this piece from Juan Forero, from the Wall Street Journal, with this almost comical image. For those of you who are listening, this image has 4 arrows, all of them leading out of Venezuela, leaving any reasonable person with the impression that Venezuela is the hot spot, right? It is the center of drug trafficking in South America, when it isn't. It is a very small player. There's a minuscule amount of drugs in the grand scheme of things that transit through Venezuela. We know, as I mentioned previously, most of it actually comes out of Ecuador these days. Most of cocaine is actually being produced inside of Colombia still. And of course, much of the transit happens actually through Central America and many of the Caribbean islands when it does happen in the Atlantic. But you see this very obvious effort to try to convince the public that Trump's claims around drug trafficking and that this is actually a legitimate effort at stopping drug trafficking is somehow acceptable. You know, again, and I have to emphasize, the US's own documents, the United Nations drug programs, all of them are clear about the minor role. It was really quite telling, I think, when we saw Trump yesterday being asked for evidence around this strike on the latest boat that was hit by U.S. forces in the Caribbean, saying, well, you can see all the packages of cocaine and fentanyl floating. Fentanyl is not even produced in South America. It is mostly produced through precursors that come into Mexico or the United States. They are not part of this chain of drug trafficking at all when it comes to fentanyl. So it shows they're just making things up. And then we see like these kinds of things, right? I mean, there's so much propaganda at work here. Even words like as much as 500 tons could be, right? All of this really deliberately vague language. This is what we know as the manufacturing of consent. This is clearly an effort to try to justify the unjustifiable, that these actions are somehow legitimate. Berg in particular really upsets me because he talks about Maduro's regime's criminal nature. You're the criminals. You're the
Absolutely.
criminals. I wrote just below this here, I'll read it out to those of you who are joining us just by audio. What's criminal is the year-long sanctions campaign aimed at making the Venezuelan people suffer as much as possible, what we at Venezuelanalysis have called the war without bombs. It's the endless series of imperialist regime change plots. It's the murder of people on tiny boats. It's the flaunting of international law. Don't get it twisted. The criminals are the people in the White House. It's not Maduro. And it's really, really important for us to be able to have these spaces, to be able to denounce this, because this is an integral part to any regime change effort. And I feel like it's not working. I feel like people, certainly in Venezuela, I mean, that goes without saying, but in Latin America and even within the United States, it's very hard to convince people that Trump is acting out of an interest of protecting lives. And finally, I did want to also say that, he talks about these boats representing an imminent threat. In the first case, as information finally made its way out, we had some leaks. It turns out that they did a double tap. They striked the boat. There were survivors who were trying to escape this onslaught from the most advanced military on the planet. And they hit them again to kill the survivors as they were fleeing. That's a crime. On top of the fact that this is a violation of international law, that these are extrajudicial killings, to kill people as they are fleeing when they're not even combatants is clearly a crime. So these are the criminals. And we have to really emphasize that. So I wanted to hear from you as well. We've had a couple of articles here on the website. This one from Joe Emmensberger and Roger Harris around the elements in place for this strike on Venezuela, and this one from Vijay Prasad. The United States uses a fabricated drug charge for a potential strike on Venezuela. I'd be happy to hear from you around what your sense of the international response has been, and if you feel like maybe there's something lacking. We saw Maduro calling for an international Congress or convention to deal with this issue. I know we've seen Lula talking about bringing this up at the UN. Is that enough? Do we need to see more action at the international level around this very clear, dangerous escalation?
Well, all these steps are good, especially I think that Maduro's call actually on Monday in his presser for Congress, for a meeting of CELAC, and a call for really respecting Latin America, the Caribbean as a zone of peace, which is the historical vocation, we could say, of the region. So these are important steps, but there needs to be more, and there needs to be more action from the region, because as I was saying before, and as you are saying yourself, José Luis, this is not only a threat, a very real threat to Venezuela, and not only a threat, of course, to the people who have been killed extrajudicially, but there are real tragedies there. We need to see a response. There was an article from Politico about a little bit over a week ago. Politico, of course, being a mouthpiece for the democratic establishment, but nonetheless, because there are frictions between these two one wings of the same party, There is an article by Politico where there is information about a leak of a document of the new military strategy document by the Pentagon and basically actually by the Trump administration. This is important. It's important to understand this document because in this, according to this leak, as a leak, we cannot confirm it, but Politico probably does have good tentacles into the Pentagon, and the Pentagon may well actually deliver the information to Politico as well. We would be facing a change of a strategy in U.S. military war policy, and this shift would be the following: the first in the new policy, in the new war policy of the United States, would be a shift towards the hemisphere. China, the so-called threat of China, which we don't need to go into. Of course, China is not a threat to the United States, to the people of the United States. It is a threat, however, to its hegemony. But when we think about this shift, this possible shift in the military policy towards the hemisphere that is concerning not only to us, to Venezuelans, but also to all the people of Latin America. Look, for the last 25 years or so, for the period of the Bolivarian Revolution, we have been saying year after year that the U.S. is going to shift toward it's going to focus more on Latin America. We have been saying it over and over and over again. But now is when we possibly are seeing it on ink over paper. And that is actually something that should be of great concern, not only to the people of Latin America, but of course to the people of the world and the people of the US who believe that countries should be sovereign beyond the specifics of the Bolivarian Revolution, that countries have the right to be sovereign. Those who do not believe that the US should be the police of the continent and of the world should be very concerned about these changing policies. Of course, I should not say that the prior policy of the United States was a better policy, but for those of us who live, who actually have our feet and live in this continent, this is of a great concern. So yes, everybody, I mean, all the countries, all the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean should come together at the UN, in the CELAC, everywhere. There has to be a very coordinated action. There have to be statements. There have to be, of course, mobilizations also in the United States, in general, in the global north, but especially in the United States, in the imperial core. There have to be mobilizations against these. People have to do things as simple as write to their representatives, but not one at a time, but there has to be mobilization on all fronts, because what we are facing is very dangerous in Venezuela, and what the continent is facing is very, very dangerous.
I'm really glad you brought up this leak from Politico. Of course, we're talking here about the National Defense Strategy document. It isn't public yet, but you're right. I read the same article. It appears that there definitely is a shift. China, Russia now take a backstage role, a secondary role, and the emphasis seems to be on our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, as it's sometimes called, Nuestra America, which is actually somewhat logical if you understand the way that imperialism has been morphing under this administration. We have to also recognize that some of the US's own policies are actually putting historic rivals in the same room together. And I'm talking about, Vietnam and China, or India and China, right? The now even more solid connection relationship between Russia and China. Of course, I mentioned China in all of those because, as you well said, they are the United States' rival. And of course, I think it's always important to mention, you hear these talking heads on these talk news shows, these cable news shows saying, oh, China wants to replace the United States. And, they've always been clear. They don't seek to have hegemony, but they do seek to have mutually beneficial relationships with the world. And that really, I think, has been the difference, and why you see, for example, Venezuela having this really high level diplomatic relationship with China, the all weather relationship. And I think it's also important to mention that we saw an important statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China saying that they oppose this. And I think that part is particularly important to emphasize as well. So, just to wrap up here, I wanted to finally give our viewers and listeners a sense of what can happen next, right? We talked about certain potential things, but there is also rumors that this is actually all a pressure tactic, that really this is pushing for a quote unquote negotiated exit of Maduro, to make him feel the pressure. Do you expect that that would actually happen? Do you think that Maduro would, leave office due to these pressure tactics? Or is this just fanciful thinking on the part of US imperialism trying to get what it's been basically trying to achieve for the last 20 years, which is the end of the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela?
I think that the response would be kind of like two-pronged. One, of course, this is part of the ongoing aggression against the Bolivarian process. It's part of the publicly stated intent of promoting so-called regime change in Venezuela. But linking it to what we were talking about in the last part of our conversation, in terms of the shift in the tactic, I think we also of the U.S. tactic in the hemisphere. I think we also have to fit it in that context. Sometimes the U.S. administration seems to act erratically, but I actually think when it comes to if it indeed focuses on regaining control of the continent of Nuestra America, I don't think that in itself would be particularly irrational. I don't think they would succeed, fortunately. I'm sure they would not succeed. But that objective in itself is not irrational. Why? Because of the resources, because the continent has also become important actually for China and strategically also for Russia. So when we think about the global context, and if indeed the US does this shift towards the hemisphere of aggressions, of intensified aggressions, because of course there have always been aggressions against the continent and specifically against Venezuela, it would not respond to an irrational action by somebody with orange hair. Sometimes I think that from the left, sometimes because there are expressions of irrationality in terms of behavior, we sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that everything they do is irrational. And I think we have to look for the rationality of what they do. Otherwise, we cannot prepare ourselves for the defense and for the construction of sovereign countries. So those two things are interlinked. The interest for not only Venezuela's oil, but the oil in the region, in Guyana, and in the territory that is being reclaimed, the territory that Venezuela reclaims from Guyana is in process of reclaiming, which is already being exploited, the oil there. Those are interests of the United States that in themselves may also require a military buildup, because what is happening there is actually illegal. The exploration and exploitation of oil with US transnationals in the territory that Venezuela claims its own is actually under international law illegal. So that would be kind of like a third leg to understand the overall situation that we are facing here in Venezuela. Now, the people of Venezuela are tremendously well disposed to defending the country. Of course, not everybody. That's never going to happen anywhere. But the majority of the absolute majority, I would say 99% of Venezuelans do not want an escalation, a military escalation from the US. I would really dare to say that's 99% of the people. Of course, that 1% has a big speaker in the mainstream media of the global north, so they may seem like more. So there's that. Of that 99%, not everybody would go to fight to defend Venezuela, but a large number of people would go to defend. And the Venezuelan people are being prepared to defend because we are talking, since we are not talking about a conventional war, most likely, we would be talking about focus of violence emerging in the worst of cases if there was a strike, as we were talking earlier, against somebody in the Venezuelan government. The people of Venezuela are, I think, very well prepared for a struggle against this situation, even if it were a long struggle. The people of Venezuela have been living, as you were saying before, in a condition of a war without bombs for the last 10 years, and even before, but more formally since Obama declares Venezuela a threat to the United States, the Obama decree. So the people of Venezuela are ready. The people in the communes, which are the most robust space for grassroots organization and really for the defense of the Bolivarian process, are preparing. In my commune and in every commune, people are preparing. They are preparing, like how to defend our specific commune, but also how to participate in the defense of the revolution and of the nation, really, of the country. As difficult as it is, I want to finish on an optimistic observation and reflection, and that's that the people of Venezuela are prepared, that there is something worth defending, and the majority of Venezuelan people know it. And there has been a long history of anti-imperialism in Venezuela, and of course in all of Nuestra America, in the whole continent. And that is not lost. It actually was rekindled by Chavez when in 2004 declared the Bolivarian revolution anti-imperialist, because there had been very explicit aggressions from US imperialism, including the coup against Chavez, which was supported by the United States in 2002. So this country is ready to fight. We hope we will not have to fight. We really hope it. We really hope that there will be international solidarity with the Bolivarian process and with the people of Venezuela. Anything that anybody can do is important. We really cannot do this isolated. I know that the people of Venezuela can fight, but if that were to come, we would need more international support, and especially, let's say, in the media, in the alternative media, and the streets, and so on. And well, I think that the call for now is to, make it be known that there's not an escalation of a conflict going on here, but that there's the escalation of a US aggression against a sovereign country and against revolution, the Bolivarian revolution.
Yeah, I think there isn't a clear enough appreciation of the powder keg that they appear to be messing with, and the willingness of any population in any country to defend their homeland. I mean, these are not small things that I think people are willing to simply entertain, right? When it comes to defending their homeland, they're willing to do everything that is necessary. And that even comes from, like, as you well said, critics on the right, critics from the opposition, say for the fascists, but also critics from the left who also understood that this is a time to close ranks, that this is a moment where the overwhelming priority must be the defense of the homeland, because if you allow imperialism to invade and take it away from you, it paints a very grim picture for their country, but the world in general. Cira, I'm so grateful that we were able to have this conversation. I think, in particular, your emphasis on the Venezuelan people themselves, your closeness to them, your participation as a communar, telling us these kind of details, the way that people are preparing, I think is important. If only we could get some people in Washington to listen so that they could understand that if they do go down this road, it's going to lead to another quagmire, as we saw in places like Iraq, not too long ago with the invasion by George W. Bush. This is the logic of U.S. imperialism, but hopefully they will learn the lesson this time and understand that this is an exercise in folly. And yes, we do need to see. I want to echo your call to see and hear more resistance to this kind of policy inside the United States, even within your own laws and constitution. What the United States is doing on your behalf right now is wholly illegal. You know, to simply declare a couple of boats to represent an imminent threat is not a really credible argument. They're laughing at you in your face about what they're doing, knowing full well that it's unconstitutional and illegal. If anything, right, Congress has to be notified about these kinds of actions and give authorization or withdraw it and actually stop this. Of course, that's expecting a lot from the U.S. representatives and senators. But nonetheless, as you said, a pressure campaign could go a long way. I don't think that the United States citizens and residents are really interested in yet another military misadventure that's going to lead to their own children being sent to go and die in foreign lands. I hope we have to be clear about this and that, this will not happen lightly. So, with all that said, I really do appreciate you being here with us, Cira. Any final words before we say goodbye and prepare for our next show, depending on how things play out with this situation right now as it is rapidly developing?
No, well, thank you, Jose Luis, and thank you to everybody who is listening, really, because if you are listening by this moment, it's because you actually have a commitment to the sovereignty of Venezuela, because you are committed to justice and dignity. So to everybody who's listening, who is watching, thank you, and also please spread the word. Let it be known. I suspect actually that everybody who's listening is already doing it, but I would like to say it from here, from Venezuela, from Caracas, and I would also like to say it as a communard, that it is very important for us that you mobilize, that the people of the United States mobilize against this aggression. Indeed, the people of the United States, people who live in the United States, live violence daily too. We know here in Venezuela, this is an internationalist project, and we know that there has been militarization of cities in the U.S. and that there's, of course, ongoing violence against Black and brown and migrant people. So we are also solidarious. And we hope to get your support to the degree that is possible. And yes, follow Venezuelanalysis, follow our news. Our team really does a very good job at covering what is going on. So that would be my final call there. Thank you again.
Thank you, Cira, and thank you all of you for joining us. Of course, as Cira said, follow our coverage on social media. We successfully recovered our account on Twitter, but also Venezuelanalysis.com. Of course, that is always up and running and available with information on a daily basis. And as things come out, also, we've been working double time over these last few weeks to make sure that we bring even more information. Can't tell you how many programs I've done to talk about this situation. And of course, always happy to do it because this is a moment where, Venezuela, which has really given a lot to the world, now needs us to also stand in solidarity with her and her people. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time here on the Venezuelan Analysis podcast.